now we bring in Marcel as well, and my proposal, which is also a question, is to actually move on and jump over the schedule and just continue with the panel, to have more kind of dynamics on the one hand, but also the requested informal time afterwards to really talk on this last evening. So maybe to set the ground for a more kind of generalized discussion, I would bring in a first question. I would have a second, but actually, if you feel the urge, I'm very happy to kind of step aside for that. But maybe as a first question, to tie your presentations in with the topic title of the panel, which was autonomous infrastructures. And everybody of you tried to relate or kind of made different points actually about infrastructures on very different levels, different aspects. And I would just ask you to maybe make one reflection on this title in terms of, is that possible? What is an autonomous infrastructure? Given, like, I mean, the basic definition of infrastructure is it's kind of the support systems of a society which makes other things possible, like the basic functions of a society or production, maybe. And of course, all these projects somehow relate back to the existing structures and social structures in societies in very intricate ways. Sometimes they kind of parasitically hijack these structures. Sometimes they just kind of live on buying the necessary resources and trying to build parallel infrastructure. Sometimes they mix up like autonomous projects, small-scale projects, commercial projects. So I would like you to comment on what is an autonomous infrastructure. Are you actually building that? And if that makes sense, that term, what does it really mean? And as an alternative, I would bring in, if you feel uncomfortable with that, one idea that book also brought up, I think, on the first day, about Kindles and healing Kindles, like the Kindle Clinic. Because my last discussion I had on infrastructures in a very kind of similar constellation of projects was that actually one way to think about what we are doing with these projects is not kind of just rebuilding infrastructures or setting up a parallel world, but actually healing things, patching stuff, patching the internet maybe. And so I'm wondering, like, whether you could relate to that, maybe kind of re-describe your projects in terms of what Telecomics said, like the internet is always broken, we always have to fix it, like whether that would be an alternative way to describe what autonomous infrastructure building actually is. And maybe Marcel, because you didn't have the chance yet, and you should start.
Okay, so I would start in trying to say what would be autonomy in relation to what. So I would start with saying that the world, and in recent instance I would say the world and capitalism, by network or through network effect ends up in monopolies. And monopolies are actually, like, from like a systemic kind of perspective, these are the asymmetries of power, these asymmetries of distribution of power. And I think that we never really had a world which was like great in that sense. We always had like a huge asymmetries of power. And I think that internet is just making, just like as many other things, is just making that so obvious. So the world outside of internet tends to go there, but internet just makes it like many times just ridiculous. So I think that it's good to see what's the IT world, and especially here, I think that we tend to see the whole world as a IT world. And I think that that here we need to say that the IT world and all of these like bad monopolies like Amazon and Google, which we like notice, they're still not the biggest like bad guys in the world. So if we just like compare them with the oil industry, with the development, corruption in development, with finances, with entertainment industry in that sense. We can see that IT world is not that strong. So in that sense, our bad guys many times look like good guys because they are smaller guys fighting with the bigger guys, and that's what I would like to bring here. And I think that's what I mentioned last time, is that the infrastructures, as I see them, are like are becoming infrastructures when they scale up at certain level. And I think that in these scales, we got like a couple of these big bad guys like Google and Amazon. And what is interesting is that when they get to that scale, they kind of start to resonate with needs of, it's in such a broad way, in such a vague way, that they start to resonate many times with the public interest. So even being the bad guys, even knowing about their monopolies, sometimes they just like look like they're also fighting the right struggle. So I would just say, one example, I told that example many times, like when Google was like fighting for the frequency of which was left after TV was getting digital. So they actually they invested I will not go into many details, but at one moment Google just became the strongest player for keeping that frequency open and deregulated in a way that it will serve the public. And many actors were there. We have people who are fighting for the radio to be like a two ways, not a broadcasting media, having pirate radios. We have these people like for decades fighting for the public domain in the world of radio frequencies. But somehow that bad guy from IT world became the guy who was like protecting that. And of course they were not protecting that because they had public interest at first, but they had their interest at first, but that resonates with the public interests. And then I'm trying to bring that because I think that it's hard to criticize. I mean that the critique becomes a very complex when we face that. And another one is just with the Amazon, what they did. So last year it was big. It was a big year where Amazon was accused for very true reasons that they exploit workers in the warehouses. So a lot of people got very kind of pissed off how they treat the workers in the warehouses. And the Amazon answer is not really that they start to respect and treat labor workers in a very good way. They did the biggest acquisition in the last year by buying the biggest company which deals with the robots in the warehouses. So very soon we actually will have warehouses without exploitation of workers because they are replaced by robots. So that's another kind of thing which I would like just to think about. So how to approach that? And I have two ways. I think that the world got into the very bad condition, and you probably noticed that there is a lot of nervous kind of moves here. That's because Ljubljana is now in a big riot. There is a violence out there. You can hear the helicopters and things like that. And I think that's one way how to approach the world. So we need to confront it violently. And that's what we did with this festival. So in many ways this is civil disobedience. There is nothing, we did a huge illegal action here. But we are still not under the radar, not under these helicopters or whatever, but that's how we can approach that. Because I think that the only way how we can get the position for struggle is just to break the flow of capital. So we are trying to do that with civil disobedience, saying fuck you with all of your legal regulation. I really, truly adore what you guys do in Internet Archive, but I think that you are also aware that if there is nothing else, if we don't really fight, struggle, and do illegal things, actually we will lose Internet Archive at one moment, just as we are losing a public library. So I think that that's a very legitimate approach to day. So just to confront it, and so it's like whatever, whatever. But then there is another one. It's very hard to get in that position. We maybe will never be noticed by that bad system, even doing our best actually in doing our best effort to be as illegal as possible. And another one is how to actually use these infrastructures. And I think that what is also very interesting with that autonomy, fighting for the autonomy, is that if you want to fix the end-to-end, you heard from Brian, because we kind of lost the end-to-end network, which we would like to have, because then the end is really empowered by the architecture. We actually, one of the cheapest and easiest way is to use virtual machines in the cloud, which I consider to be like the bad guys, because that's actually easier to provide for the end user, for Mac users or for Windows users, because they don't know how to start a server. So we need to actually bypass these failures in the architecture. And it seems, at least for me, it seems that we need to go and use that infrastructure, which is already monopoly, in order actually to fight against that monopoly. And being scaling up all of these efforts is super hard. But what I'm trying to say is that it's super complex. So there is no approach. All of these are small. This one is like a quite big internet archive. But at the same time, what I think is that it doesn't provide us that position of struggle, but it can support with the BitTorrents. So when we have enough of internet archive in the traffic, then the bad guys cannot say BitTorrent is used just for the blockbusters, and then we can say okay, BitTorrent is here, so we are keeping that. So this is how I kind of map what's the problem, how we get these monopolies, symmetries of power, and then different approaches. One is a violent civil disobedience, and another one is basically just trying to revert and to subversively use these infrastructures. So it was quite long.
I think it was good to kind of lay a ground floor, and I would take out these concepts or kind of these grades, scales, it's not scales, but these kind of relative terms of small and big, legal, illegal, and you basically pointing out they're not kind of congruent necessarily. Like there are some complications which we already heard about, kind of the different situations of what Alessandro and Aaron, for example, presented, but now you're taking it kind of inside the bad empire and say it's also more complicated there. So that's a lot of stuff for discussion already. I would propose, because you didn't present, that we still go on and you give your snapshot on this question of autonomous internets, maybe a little bit shorter, because we actually have a lot of people doing infrastructure, so we want to open up very soon. Who would feel most compelled?
Well, I mean, I'll keep it short. But I mean, for me, it depends on context. So if I talk about the context of hybrid publishing consortium, the idea of autonomy and infrastructure go hand in hand. The idea of an infrastructure, to me, is that it's something you make for other people to use, to have their autonomy, for them to experiment. The infrastructure itself isn't autonomous. I don't even really see open source as being autonomous. I see the open source as a method to give someone autonomy. I mean, open source is a design methodology that every big corporate and most technologists use. So for me, and the problem is that we see, again, it does depend on the case and the context, but I just see about the kind of the problems with capitalism and how it shapes technology. Just take the little Kindle e-reader and ePubs too. How it just, for wanting to control the whole market, it destroys 400 or 500 years of typography to do that, and that's in the interest of them containing the market. So that's for me.
very briefly, there are a couple of things which I'm triggered from what you said. One thing which I think it's important in infrastructure is scalability, especially in what you just said, Simon, the fact that infrastructure are provided for other people to be used. So it's quite essential that we could construct or being able to construct infrastructures which can be scalable and can be used at a small level as well as a very large level, as very large constructions. This scalability could provide, I mean, I'm always, for my humble perspective, I'm always trying to see as this kind of infrastructure can become popular when can be adopted by a large amount of people, whatever they are. And it's also very important when it comes to content. That this infrastructure would enable people to decide about the content that could be part of this infrastructure, that could be eventually shared. You were mentioning this corporation approach to content, which I think it's something very important to think about. One of the main reasons of this very small effort in sharing your collection is, of course, the first step to then sharing the content of that collection. And the more specific it is, the less marketable it is. Nevertheless, it could be quite relevant in the specific cultural context. So the reappropriation or the appropriation of a sharing infrastructure, and but not only of the infrastructure for sharing, but of the tools for providing content that we already have or we produce to be shared, it's also quite essential. From a small level to much broader level. So I think it's these two things, scalability and the ability to personally provide content, are also quite important.
So much to discuss. Before I forget, I just wanted to say on the question of the complex relationship between taking in the service of social justice, the different roles that different people can play. I think the role that in a very public-facing institution that has accrued a lot of social goodwill, political goodwill, sometimes in strange places. It has the opportunity to serve the role that is really only servable by the accumulated gravitas and social and political capital that an institution like the archive has. And that's that there's a role for someone to be the one wearing the suit. I did an art project a couple of years ago, and it was about one of the first formally organized protests on ecological grounds, and is sometimes credited as one of the births of the American ecological movement in the 70s. The activation of the public to preserve common spaces in the name of ecology. And the person who was the instigator of the entire movement was an artist who was a woman, but when she formed a foundation at the time, this was in the late 60s and into the early 70s, she packed the boards with male friends, with men. And when she was interviewed later and asked why she did that, she said in the context of the time, she needed people who could go, quote unquote, belly to belly, like who were in the same social clubs, who were in the same political spheres as the ones with whom they were going to be negotiating in order to achieve their aims. So it was a tactical maneuver. And so having an ally like the Unit Archive, that is someone who is perceived as a white hat wearing a suit, sometimes allows the achievement of strategic and tactical aims that would be difficult to achieve through a voice that is more engaged in direct critique or direct confrontation. So I wanted to just say that as a side. On the question of infrastructure, one of the points in the slide that I blew past was that we estimate that the cost for us, we have 10 petabytes of content growing about 1 petabyte or more a year and accelerating, of course. And we estimate that for that content, the cost of preserving 1 terabyte in perpetuity, and we assume that the cost is going to become asymptotic to zero over time with, to a reasonable extent with the increasing storage density and energy efficiency, et cetera, but nonetheless, we estimate it's going to cost about $2,000 to store 1 terabyte of data in perpetuity, and we have 10 petabytes of holding. So the scale of investment and capital required by an institution like us to preserve the holdings we have is non-trivial. And the cost for preserving that same terabyte when you don't have the efficiencies at scale that we have evolved is, of course, going to be considerably higher, maybe at least an order of magnitude higher, which kind of raises me to the question of what is infrastructure? And I think one of the things in infrastructure is something that in many contexts becomes that which you need to mobilize a society or a civilization to provide for its members through a collective, distributed effort, but through the concentrated accumulation of resources. That doesn't mean they need to be focused in a particular place. It doesn't mean that the Internet Archive should be given a lot of money to undertake this. Quite the contrary. As I said, we're highly interested in distributing that. But in order for us to be able to do something like a distributed backup of our contents, whatever they may be, requires an investment, a payment, essentially ultimately of a tax in some form, if you want to put it in those terms, which is the cost of being a good Internet citizen. If we want to preserve cultural materials that have a digital existence, at a certain point we're going to have to pay for it. And one model that is highly popular today is we pay commercial entities, and at least in the US, the capitalist presumption is that by doing so we're achieving some sort of market efficiencies and providing appropriate rewards that motivate risk-taking, that enable the construction of institutional frameworks that allow for undertaking those projects at that scale. But there's an alternative approach, which would be to find other ways that individuals can contribute in something that at a certain point breaks down in real dollars, the real individual cost, in the service of serving the public communal goal of preserving. So we're an archive, so we're just primarily in preservation of materials. That's the context that I describe these things in. But to make this completely concrete, when we've been talking to BitTorrent, one of the things we've been talking about is making it extremely frictionless so that people who are engaging our content have the opportunity to simultaneously preserve it. In other words, it's one thing right now when you do an HTTP download, it's a one-way transaction. You download something, and the fact that you have it disappears over an event horizon. And the reconstruction of a network, reconstruction of an archive from those materials over those event horizons is extremely difficult. The difference with the BitTorrent technology is that, at least in principle, that material is still visible to the outside world and recoverable by other players, either intentionally or through some automated mechanism. So we've been talking to BitTorrent about the notion of simply making it the case that in order to giving people, or in fact encouraging people by making it the default case that when you engage the archive and download materials from it, or an institution like us with similar goals, you automatically are seeing it. And the specifics of that, whether that's discoverable through DHT or whatever, that's all to be determined. But the primary notion is simply that when you pay a small penalty, in this case, you reserve a certain amount of your hard drive space for the preservation of content, which may include even things that you didn't choose to download but are underrepresented, that aren't well backed up. So that's what that means is you're paying a real cost. You're paying some percentage of your hard drive space in the service of the communal good, which in this case would be the infrastructure. And I guess this is a long-winded and specific example of infrastructure has a cost associated with it. And that's what we mean when we talk about the cloud having concrete feet. The cloud, the cloud is not an ephemeral thing. The cloud has a cost. And the services it can provide can be seen as public commons, but the maintenance of the commons requires considerable effort and resource. And that resource has to be forthcoming from all of us at some point. And figuring out a way to do that makes people cognizant of the fact that it's happening so that they are aware of what they're buying into and supporting this.
Thanks, Aaron. I think Marcel has just kind of called the specters of civil disobedience that we are confronted with that call and the action that kind of is in the back of all these discussions. I would now, open after kind of a lot of input and a lot of front talk. And I'm very happy at the end because this kind of replaces my second question, would have been about when I had these discussions in India, the people were saying, I don't want to talk about infrastructures anymore, because infrastructures are kind of these technologically neutral projects which are implemented on us by some outside always. They said they would rather like to talk about the infrastructures of infrastructures and get to these questions which were hinted at here. And I think this question of money which you raised is like one way to go about that. But yeah, maybe let's talk about the infrastructures or whatever has come to your mind during this terabyte of input. There's a mic which is circulating. So make yourself heard, seen.
Oh. I don't know, well, whether this is really any productive thought, but yeah, when Aaron, you were talking about like survival of archive.org, I was thinking it's kind of almost, the kind of work this organization is doing is almost like something that is so universal that is kind of expectable to be provided by as a public service, as a kind of I never kind of thought about it before, but it really connects to the idea of a welfare state and the fact that this is like a public service as a public library is. Then I was thinking, like, whether you have, the organization has any, it's not, any connections to, like, European Union, and like, maybe like there are like more chances to get governmental funding for like what you guys are doing. Like this kind of now I cannot really think about examples of like whether this was ever possible, but like this kind of grassroots initiative, I think like this could be really like a nice and good example when grassroots initiative could really get the kind of more its service would translate to kind of a public need.
This one, this one seems good. Just worth, I know we're very short of time, so I'll answer it very briefly just to say, so we're a nonprofit organization. In the US, that means we're a non-governmental organization. We're largely supported by foundation money from, and also from contracts. Some of the contracts we get do come from governmental agencies. We work with the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian Institute. We also do a lot of contract web crawling for large-scale partners, including several governments other than the US government. We do whole domain crawls for certain countries and things like that. So some of the funding comes through that mechanism. We are a library. In fact, Brewster's title is librarian. That's like, and that's reflected in our booklet. I think because we are closely allied with some other organizations like the Electronic Frontier Foundation that have fairly distinct political goals in the context of influencing policy and public opinion and public debate, setting context for public debate. So I think there's a latitude that comes with being outside of government, being beholden to the US government, especially now. Like Brewster was very, very vocal in opposition to SOPA, and has been vocal in opposition to related things. We're big champions of anonymity and civil libertarian concerns online, and we have freedom and latitude to be vocal and to put our resources behind fighting those things because we're governmental, which is paradoxically at odds with, I agree with you completely, that our culture should be preserved and that should be taken seriously by our governments, and right now it's falling into organizations like us and individuals to do it. Just one particular case in that point is the television recording that we're doing and the making available of it. The Library of Congress was mandated by the US Congress to begin with recording television like over 20 years ago, and has never gotten it together to actually do that. So Brewster observed this, and that's one reason 10 years ago he said, screw this, we're just going to do it. And now that belatedly the government is looking at what we're doing and very fond of, it turns out we like approach things in the right way and ship the right hands, wearing the right suits, so that we're getting a lot of institutional support from organizations like the FCC in the US who would have the authority to otherwise shut us down. And part of it is out of this perception that we're actually fulfilling a public service that wasn't undertaken even by the Library of Congress, which was enjoined to do so.
Just, you can make it like this. Two technical things. One is the people organizing this have kind of pointed that we really have to close in some minutes. So Sebastian is next. I would just ask everybody to gear up. If you have thoughts and want this discussed in the forum here, kind of immediately follow up on this. The second one is maybe a plea to the organizers of the local people to make true on the promise of informal discussions. It would be nice, I think, if we break up to announce like one place where we all go and collect for, if it's not the streets, like many other places.
We could quickly the direction. They're actually protecting the building over there. We will talk.
I found your presentation on archive.org very fascinating for one reason, because on one hand I was aware of almost every single bullet point of what you presented, and still I have the feeling now, having seen that presentation, that it's sometimes good to be reminded of this, because in many ways like this, your kind of current questions, new fields that you're kind of discovering. Of course, a lot of, and I was thinking of, okay, what are the problems I'm personally dealing with at the moment, and the strategies for these? What are we doing, things that I'm doing with young projects, some of the projects we've presented, and in a broader we, what are we dealing with? So clearly, you're the petabytes people, we're the terabytes people. But us being the terabytes, or me being the terabytes person, would actually have to mean that I should be much more advanced, because I can do more, I don't have to make these compromises so much. And I find it surprisingly that if you're talking about the difference in order of magnitudes from terabytes to petabytes, that actually a lot of the stuff you're currently kind of trying to crack, be it legally, technically, but also in terms of community, and are so similar to the things we're trying to crack on the terabytes level. I have a very practical question, maybe we can talk about it later so much. I was very surprised to see relatively recently there's a dark web, part of the dark web, a place that I find great to get contemporary music, that recently announced a cooperation with Archive.org. Are you like the BitTorrent person at the moment? Are you the person to talk to when it comes to similar such archiving ideas? Because my experiences with analog archives, film museums, how did they come into place? How did people start film museums? These are all stolen copies. Cinema didn't return the copy. Archive got it. I think you have to be in that dark gray area. You have to start archiving there, otherwise nothing is going to happen. I think if you're the BitTorrent.
Okay. Any other ideas? Not this dark, possibly, or the informal? Like going into the dark afterwards.
Why?
Yeah. Okay, so then I would just say, give you the chance. Do you want to kind of also react to the last two comments, or do you rather feel like informal talking in dark place?
Thank you. This is the official end of yeah. Okay. I would just like to say, as representing the organization here of the festival. We kind of finished it in Pipa a few hours ago. Now we are finishing here. For sure, it's not the end. See you somewhere else next time, having more terabytes, trying to reach the petabytes, and just get there, like like we said in the last few days. Thank you very much, everybody.
Okay, bye.